Chomsky, welcome. In your writings on the subject, it's clear that you see Mr. Milosevic and the Serbians as the bad guys in the Balkans lately. Our first question is, where would you have intervened to frustrate him? Or would you? And when and how?
Well, we have to pick the time and place. Up until 1995, there was a quite impressive and successful nonviolent movement among the Kosovar Albanians. Ibrahim Rugova was the president. They had set up a parallel government. They were essentially running their own internal autonomy under conditions of civil disobedience. They were completely sold out by the West. The United States wouldn't give them the time of day. At the Dayton Agreement, at the Dayton meetings, they weren't even allowed to take part. The result was that among Kosovar Albanians, there was a recognition of something which unfortunately is true, and we ought to be concerned about the fact that it's true, and that is that the United States government understands nothing but force. They came to recognize that. The KLA, which was up till then a kind of a ragtag group of guerrillas, began to gain popular support. It started to carry out attacks against police stations, against civilians from foreign bases with foreign support. The Serbs were surprisingly slow to respond, but by last summer they did begin to respond, and they responded pretty brutally with retaliation against civilians. By the end, according to NATO, by February, there were about 2,000 people had been killed and a few 100,000 refugees, which is an atrocity, but unfortunately an all too familiar one. So, for example, the State Department reports on Colombia just came out with almost the same numbers for last year, just to make one of many examples. At that point, all through this time, there were options. The options continued up until March 24th.
I want to focus specifically on the Balkans, not exclusively on Kosovo. We've been reading and seeing evidence of atrocities in the Balkans throughout the 90s. At what point does the human predicament warrant, in the Balkans specifically, some intervention by the United States? What should we have been doing there? And at what point, if any, would you have used military force?
Well, I think it is a serious mistake to ask that question about the Balkans specifically. We ask that question because that's what the government tells us to do, and I don't think that's the way to look at issues. So in all such cases, and there are many much worse than this going on right now, we have basically three choices, just by logic. We can do nothing. That's one choice. We can act in such a way as to make the situation worse, to escalate the atrocities, or we can act in such a way as to try to mitigate them. Those are the three possibilities. Now, in some cases, it's quite obvious how to do this. So in the case of, say, Turkey right next door, where the atrocities are far worse, and they're rather similar in character, but much worse, Clinton intervened to escalate them. So he escalated expanded the huge flow of arms to Turkey so that they could carry out slaughters, ethnic cleansing, driving out millions of refugees on a scale much worse than Kosovo last year, much worse. In Colombia, same story. Send arms to the military, which are used to maintain the atrocities. In other places, we do nothing. So, for example, in Africa, where there were possibilities of, where the British and the United Nations were trying to introduce peacekeeping forces to prevent what could, and in fact did, blow up to be major wars, the Clinton administration refused to provide trivial sums, therefore torpedoing the agreement. So we decided to do nothing. In the case of so where does Kosovo fit into this? Well, in the case of Kosovo, the United States acted about the way it did in Turkey, though through different modalities. Namely, it acted to escalate the atrocities. So it was clear. I can't say it was totally predictable, but it was certainly very likely.
There's a monster leap there. I mean, in Turkey, the bad guys happen to be our ally.
And us. Us, remember, not just our ally. There was 80% U.S. arms which were being sent to, which were increasing. As the atrocities increased, the arms flow increased.
But no, we're talking about the Kurds, the Kurdish Turks, or the Kurds under the boot of our allied government, the Turks. But it's a I mean, we're on the other side. We may have been party to, may have triggered an escalation by Milosevic, but it's exactly a reverse relationship. And I don't want to. First of all, the whole matter of consistency of United States or foreign policy around the world is a kind of a different issue. I do want to keep the focus on Kosovo because, if only because, for whatever reason, it is the human crisis or the crisis on page 1.
Yes.
And it's one that you acknowledge. It's not.
Yes, I do. It's on page 1, and it ought to be on page 6. If we were honest, we would say, here's a range of atrocities. We ought to be concerned with all of them, not just follow the marching orders that were given from Washington. But, okay, let's follow those marching orders and look just at Kosovo. Now, what should we have done? Well, on March 20, you have to ask when. Say March 23rd, okay, the day before the bombing. Let's pick that day. On March 23rd, the U.S. had pushed through NATO an agreement, the Rambouillet Agreement, which it had essentially compelled the KLA to sign, and the Serbian parliament rejected it. Now, how did the Serbian parliament reject it? Well, what they said is we will grant autonomy to Kosovo, but we will not accept the military forces of a foreign military alliance on our territory, namely a NATO alliance. They did go on to pass a resolution on March 23rd, which said that after the autonomy agreement is arranged among the ethnic groups in Kosovo, we can move on to international peacekeeping forces, though not NATO. They meant not NATO, didn't say, but they meant not NATO forces, but international peacekeeping forces.
I mean, again, all these are a lot of them are words. I don't think you wouldn't want Milosevic and Serbs in these circumstances guaranteeing your autonomy, and you wouldn't have taken their promise of autonomy.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
But I also wouldn't. We were asking what the options were. One option was to pursue the diplomatic path and to see whether this modality of bringing in international peacekeepers could have worked. Another option was to decide to escalate the atrocities, namely by carrying out a bombardment, which predictably led to an escalation of the atrocities. I mean, let me just quote the U.S. commander, General Clark. 2 days after the bombing, he informed the New York Times that it was, in his words, entirely predictable that the atrocities would sharply escalate as a result of the bombing. Well, entirely is a little too strong, but it was certainly a highly likely consequence. It's a fact that when you bomb people, they react where they're strong, not where you're strong. They have to be strong on the ground. So it was one predictable consequence of the bombing, of the path we chose, was to sharply escalate the atrocities. There were no refugees registered by the UN High Commission of Refugees on March 24th. There are now a couple 100,000. That's only one effect. The other effect has been to devastate, maybe finally demolish, the very promising and courageous democratic movement in Belgrade. When you start, the son of Milovan Djilas the other day said, we've been united from the heavens, not by God, but by the bombs. He
said he thought only God could unite the Serbs, but now the bombs have.
Well, that's of course true. You start bombing people and, smashing up their bridges and filling up their hospitals. They resist. They join. Now Milosevic has more support than he ever did. That was also predictable. We've probably wiped out the democratic movement in Montenegro. There are serious crises in Macedonia. I mean, that's what happens from blind, mindless use of violence. which happens to be what the Clinton administration and its predecessors moved towards automatically.
I want to also remember, though, that before that bombing, there were these Nike takeoff T-shirts seen among the Kosovars. Just do it. Let's get it on. Milosevic must be confronted. The Hitler memories always come up, but sort of a line has to be drawn. Certain kinds of people are insufferable, sort of thing. And even the people who, in a matter of days, would be refugees felt, and I think some of them still feel, it had to be done.
Maybe, and I'm sure if you went to Colombia, you could. If in Colombia last year there were 300,000 refugees generated, according to the State Department, mostly by the army and paramilitaries. They add to the over 1 million who are already there. That's the biggest refugee crisis maybe in the world. If you ask those people who've been viciously and murderously driven out of their homes, I don't doubt that many of them would say bomb Bogota. Should we do it?
Even knowing that
Even if they know that it'll get worse. Yeah, just the same situation. I don't think we should bomb Bogota, nor should we bomb Washington, which is providing its arms. But I'm sure you can find people who would say that. That's not determinative of policy. You have to think, if you want to carry out a policy, you have to think about its consequences. Okay, well, the consequences in this case, there were alternatives. The alternative was to explore the diplomatic options, which did exist and still exist. Another alternative was to make the situation far worse. I didn't add all the negative consequences. There's one which, curiously, doesn't seem to bother Americans very much, and that is that it is, I mean, it's so blatantly illegal that it's not even worth discussing, but it's yet another blow to the rather fragile system of international order, which at least provides some minimal protection to the weak. Doesn't provide any protection to the strong. They do what they want. But the principles of world order, which we initiated, we instituted them, they provide some measure of protection against predatory states. Now, I don't think they're ironclad. I think you can think of cases where they shouldn't be applied, but it's like a system of law generally. You never expect it to be applied 100%. So, for example, there's laws against cannibalism, but they're relaxed for people caught on lifeboats, and that's the way the law works. However, it's worth having law, and it's worth having the international framework of world order, although the United States has been dedicated to destroying it for years, and furthermore says so. So, for example...
Well, let me just interrupt. I mean, people are struck here by a kind of collision of the rule against the bombing or invasion of sovereign states without the UN's sanction here. But there also that collides with clearly tremendous wholesale continuing violation, a predatory treatment of the Kosovars by the Serbian government. How do you cut through the Russian-Chinese veto at the UN to say people who, as we said, I mean, they want to bring the world down to relieve their own agony?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. It's at the United Nations, the primary barrier to stopping aggression has been the U.S. veto. The U.S. is far in the lead in vetoes in the United Nations since the 1960s. Britain is second. France is a distant third.
Again, that's...
So if we want, we have to be realistic. It's the United States that bars UN Security Council resolutions calling on states to terminate their aggression and atrocities, overwhelmingly. In this particular case, you're right. It would have been the Russian and Chinese veto. And you're also right that I think we can point, there has been long noted since the 40s, a kind of a tension between two fundamental principles of international law. The UN Charter bars aggression, use of force, threat or use of force without Security Council authorization. On the other hand, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides for rights of people against their own state. Okay, now there's a tension between those two, and it's in that tension that the issue of so-called humanitarian intervention arises. and it should be faced seriously. It's not a trivial case. Look at it in every case. So there are cases that really do. This is not a case that qualifies. This is a case in which the...
This does not qualify for international relief, a sort of NATO ride to the rescue? Is the house on fire?
No, quite the opposite, as we can see from the consequences. And it was predictable in advance. What happened was that NATO set the fire. I mean, it's as if, let me make a mundane analogy. Suppose when I leave here, I see a crime in the streets. So I see someone robbing someone else. And I say, well, I can't just stand here and let this go on. So I pick up an assault rifle and kill them both, and kill a couple of bystanders on the side. And then when I'm asked, well, why'd you do that? I say, well, what could I do? I couldn't just stand there and let it happen. That's not a humanitarian act. And in fact, that's pretty much what happened. There were options of pursuing the peaceful means that are required by international law. There was the option of doing nothing, as we do in much worse cases, let's say in Africa. Or there was the option of making the fire much worse, which is what we did. So that's not a humanitarian intervention. There are real cases. And if we want to understand U.S. policy, after all, we should want to understand it, we should look at the real cases. So the most dramatic case in recent years is the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. I mean, that terminated awesome atrocities. In December, how did the U.S. react? Well, by bitterly condemning and punishing Vietnam for having had the audacity to terminate Pol Pot's atrocities. We supported a Chinese invasion. We imposed harsh sanctions. The New York Times denounced them as the Prussians of Asia. Yeah, that was a plausible humanitarian intervention, and it tells us what U.S. policy is towards humanitarian intervention, just as Clinton's dedicated escalation of atrocities in Turkey, pretty much at the same time that this is all going on, and at a much worse level, tells us something about the humanitarian motives. I mean, I think it is a serious error to just focus on what the government orders us to look at, Kosovo. We have to look at it in a broader context to understand Kosovo.
We'll do it. We'll do it with the help of callers, too. The phone's 1-800-423-8255. We're trying to think of Kosovo in the big picture, including Vietnam, but also to try not to be hooked on the Vietnam history necessarily, and to see it fresh. 1-800-423-8255 with Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT. 1-800-423-TALK is the connection phone. Ken is on the line.
Thanks, Chris. I was interested by Mr. Chomsky's scenario of killing the aggressor and killing the victim as being an absurd one. And I do agree, although I think it was done with the intention of killing the aggressor, killing the victim, with the hope that 100,000 other victims wouldn't be killed by the man with the gun. So I guess my question is, in light of the fact that there were massacres that occurred in Racek, and that they are pretty much accepted as being crimes against humanity, what would Mr. Chomsky say would have been the route the U.S. could have taken diplomatically, knowing the history of the Serbs in Bosnia, and knowing that eventually the question not only of sovereignty in international law would be questioned, but also the question of whether Mr. Milosevic would be a war criminal, and whether you could actually negotiate with him?
Well, the United States chose to negotiate with him and to sell out the Kosovo-Albanian nonviolent movement, remember.
Would you have said not to negotiate a date with Milosevic?
I would have said not to sell out the Kosovars. They should have been brought into it.
That was not something that was tabled. But
it was not tabled by you.
At the time, there were so many other things that had to deal with.
Excuse me, that was not tabled by U.S. decision. It was a decision to exclude the Kosovar Albanians because it was only a nonviolent successful nonviolent movement, which the U.S. had no interest in. And that is, in fact, what destroyed it. So I think that was a bad mistake. In the case of coming up to, say, March 1999, yes, there had been atrocities in Kosovo. According to NATO, 2,000 people had been killed in the previous year as the Serbs responded to KLA attacks on police stations and civilians from foreign bases. We might ask, incidentally, how the United States would respond if, let's say, Libyan-based terrorists were attacking police stations and civilians in Boston. But let's put that to the side. So then how should we have responded to the killing of 2,000 people in a year? Well, that's a situation that arises all over the world. For example, it arises in Colombia right now. It arises in Laos right now. A much worse situation arises in Turkey right now. It's tens of thousands. How do you react? Well, in these cases, you have to think through the consequences. In this particular case, which is the only one we're told to look at, the options were pretty clear on March 23rd. There was a disagreement between the United States and the Serbian parliament. Here we prefer to say Milosevic, but there was a disagreement between the United States and Yugoslavia on the terms of a diplomatic settlement. I don't think that was a final decision. I think there was room for negotiation there. We chose instead to carry out a bombing campaign, which had the effect, as predicted, of radically escalating the atrocities. Now, you say, and you could be right, that there might have been atrocities anyway. But you don't carry out murder because maybe the person you're killing might have killed somebody.
Well, I think my question was: is it a case of post-Ratchak, the U.S. feeling that they were unable to negotiate with Milosevic?
No, it was a decision by the United States. They decided that they're going to give him an ultimatum, namely Rambouillet. That was negotiation. It was after Ratchak, and it was a negotiation in which the U.S. had a position, namely the one they forged at Rambouillet. Their interlocutor with whom they were negotiating, Milosevic, had a different position. And remember, we like to demonize the individual, but this is a country, and they're supporting it. And they have a parliament. They proposed an alternative. The U.S. simply flatly refused it. The alternative is not unreasonable. In fact, if indeed...
What was the alternative that we rejected?
The alternative was a resolution of the Serbian parliament, March 23rd, to reach an autonomy agreement for Kosovo among the ethnic groups there, and then to open the question of an international observer force, by which they probably meant a UN force. Actually, the New York Times has taken even a stronger view. On April 8th, Stephen Erlanger, their Belgrade correspondent, wrote, I think he's exaggerating, but what he wrote is that the Serbian parliament had agreed to a UN military force on March 23rd. We don't really know because it's barely been covered here, but I think he's probably exaggerating. But in any event, in that domain, there was room. We've been over
this ground, but I mean, do you take the Serbian word on that they were interested in a viable kind of autonomy that Kosovars could live under?
No, any more than I take the U.S. word for it when they signed the Paris agreements or when they agreed to the Esquipulas agreements in Central America. Of course, I didn't take their word for it because they didn't mean it.
If you don't take their word for the fact that they're going to do that, and seeing that they might have allowed an impotent force to come into Kosovo, and the fact that the OSCE was on the ground and physically near Ratchak at the time of the massacres, what is our next step?
Our next step is diplomacy. Remember that those massacres that you're talking about are going on every day. Just a couple of days ago, one took place in Colombia, got about 3 lines. Do we therefore bomb Bogota? No. What we ought to do is to stop providing arms to the people carrying out the massacres and then move in diplomatic directions, knowing perfectly well that you cannot trust either them or us, because we don't keep our agreements either. That's what diplomacy is like. You're dealing with states that do not act in good faith, that have their own interests, and you try to find peaceful means between them. You keep mentioning Ratchak, and remember the NATO figures. 2,000 people killed in a year. That's unfortunately not enormous by international standards. Comment on international standards. The answer is not.
It's enough to terrorize the population and consolidate Serbian control after a fashion that you can't let them talk to you about promises of autonomy, it seems to me.
If we believe that, then we should simply remove ourselves from the scene. If the only thing we can think of doing is to make the situation far worse, then we therefore disqualify ourselves.
We're going to take a break with Noam Chomsky. This is The Connection from WBUR Boston. I'm Christopher Lydon. This is The Connection. Our guest is Noam Chomsky, the linguist who became the preeminent Dove's dove and the kind of foreign policy critic in the Vietnam period, and has been more and more involved in thinking about the law, the morality, and the effect of American policy in the world. We're talking this hour, of course, about Kosovo. Professor Chomsky, you referred earlier to the Clinton administration's kind of blind attachment to force in this case. The striking thing also here, though, is that for many years the Clinton administration didn't know what to do about the Balkans, especially after General Colin Powell had said, we do deserts, we don't do mountains. The Bush administration didn't want to fuss with the Balkans even after the outward success of the first Gulf War. Don't you see, I mean, it is radically different from Vietnam in the Kennedy-Johnson-Nixon era, in that surely the impression has been that we didn't want to use force. We didn't want to get into that rock pile.
Yeah. In fact, it is quite different from the Kennedy-Johnson era. The country was just a different country. So when John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam, to drive people, actually millions of people, it turned out, into concentration camps, to use napalm to carry out crop destruction, there was no protest. Took years before a protest developed. The Bush administration understood that it was quite different. And in fact, there is a Bush administration policy statement which was leaked, presumably by the Pentagon, and pieces of it were published in the press, New York Times, which, as they came in, saying that, quoted, it said that in the case of a confrontation with much weaker enemies, which are the only kind we think of confronting. In the case of a confrontation with much weaker enemies, we must defeat them rapidly and decisively, or else we will lose political support. Now, that's a change. That was not true in the Johnson-Kennedy period. So that's true. The population won't accept aggression on the scale of Vietnam. Now, what about the Balkans? I don't think the way you described is exactly accurate. The Bush administration and the Clinton administration stood by in the Balkans as long as it was an ugly, brutal business. At that point, they wanted the Europeans to be there. They wanted Europe to be there while it was there was brutal fighting, there wasn't any way to resolve it, and so on and so forth. What the U.S. did was stand on the sidelines, arm the Croatian military, which is not different from the Serbian military. So they armed them, trained them, changed the balance of power so that the forces of violence were roughly comparable on the two sides, supported the Croatian army when it went through Krajina, driving out a couple 100,000 Serbs. By the time the two sides were equalized and exhausted, the U.S. moved in and imposed, in effect, a partition of Bosnia. So it wasn't that they had no plan. They had a plan. It was the effective partition of Bosnia into Greater Serbia and Greater Croatia. And the U.S. waited until the dirty work was done. And when it was possible to institute this plan, it moved in and instituted it. If you think Europe is happy about that, you're wrong. Europe didn't like it at all. They were given the dirty work, and then they were kicked aside after the conditions were established that allowed the U.S. to come in and take over. But that's the reliance on the use of force is very striking. I mean, perhaps the most dramatic case right now is Iraq, where the U.S. and Britain, which is a kind of an attack dog, are internationally quite isolated. They're carrying out both on the sanctions and the bombing. The reason that the U.S. does not go to the Security Council to get authorization for its attacks is it knows it's not going to get them. And it's not just China. It's going to get them from no one. In fact, Madeleine Albright stated it very clearly as UN ambassador when the UN was refusing to go along with the whole of it, to go along with U.S. violence. She said, "We will act multilaterally when we can and unilaterally when we must for our interests." Yeah, we've heard that before. At the time of the December bombing in Iraq, the administration said, "We prefer to act with our allies, NATO, But if not, we'll act alone. Notice we do not even prefer to act with the United Nations. They're killing. The sanctions alone are killing 5,000 children a month. That's no joke.
I want to come back to the Balkans. For most of us, it takes headlines and news, and some people actually the beginning of a war for us to take it seriously or to start focusing. The question is on in this country, and people are sort of rechecking the pulse of popular opinion every day as to whether ground forces ought to be committed in retaking Kosovo, and whether this is the beginning of an even larger effort by the United States government against Serbia. For people who are waking up to this thing, what would you be telling them about the road ahead, both the policy, what ought to be done, what might be useful, what they're going to be told, what they're going to need in the way of a kind of Hemingway crap detector? What are the stakes?
The first thing I would tell them is not simply to follow the marching orders given from Washington.
Yeah.
So if you want to stop atrocities in the world, there are lots of ways to do it. We could defuse the bomblets in Laos. That would save a couple thousand people killed a year, like Kosovo last year. We could stop arming Turkey to crush its Kurds. If you want, in a lot of other cases. Let's look at Kosovo. What could we do? Ground troops would probably be the worst possible thing. And I don't think the U.S. would do it either, because it would mean first of all, it's technically quite difficult, and it would probably mean fighting a major guerrilla war for years with unknown consequences. My fear is, frankly, that what the U.S. will do is, after having predictably caused the atrocities to radically escalate, just as General Clark said, what it may do is move on to a Carthaginian solution. And if you think that that's out of character, take a walk below the 20th parallel in Vietnam. It's not out of character.
And salt the
well, we
fields.
won't salt it, but, essentially devastate it, which we can do from a distance. That's, unfortunately, more likely. In fact, one of the effects of bombing is it very much narrows the options. So options that were available on March 23rd no longer are. You mentioned before that the French had made a proposal, which in fact is very much like the Serbian proposal on March 23rd, but that may not be open. It may be that the least ugly of the alternatives open is one that's been discussed by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times and Michael Mandelbaum in the Globe and others, namely a kind of a partition in which Serbia takes the northern areas, which happen to be the ones that are richer in minerals and have the historical monuments, and the south is turned into some kind of a protectorate where some Albanians will live in misery. We may have restricted the option so that that's about the least ugly one left.